The heat pressed down hard. The kind of summer afternoon when the asphalt shimmered and air smelled of rubber, coffee, and diesel fumes from a delivery truck idling at the curb. People drifted between cafes and storefronts, shopping bags swinging, conversations easy. It was ordinary until the sound of a body hitting concrete cut through it all. A boy, barely 19, landed awkwardly on his shoulder and hip, palms scraping pavement. He stayed down a moment, breath stolen, dust sticking to sweat on his face. When he did make a sound, it was the raw sob of someone caught between pain and humiliation. Above him stood a uniformed officer, boots wide apart, arms still tense from the shove. His belt clattered with gear as he leaned forward. "Stay back," he barked, voice sharp enough to echo against shop windows. "Stay back unless you want me to show you what order looks like." The boy tried to rise on one knee, blood streaking his elbow, but his arms shook. He couldn't bring himself to look the officer in the eye. Around them, the street froze. A woman with a straw paused mid-sip. A man delivering boxes left his cart tilted on its wheels. Even the barber at the corner doorway stopped wiping his hands on a towel. The officer scanned the bystanders, sunglasses reflecting their hesitation. "Hands where I can see," he ordered, and the boy lifted them, more out of surrender than obedience. The crowd stayed silent. No one stepped forward. That silence became the first truth. The second truth spread in whispers. "That's too much," someone muttered near the cafe fence. "He's just a kid." Another voice, "Call someone." The question came back, tired and real. "Who?" The heat pressed heavier. A white grocery bag skittered across the sidewalk like a flag no one would raise. The officer let out a laugh, quick and joyless. "This is America," he said loudly, turning so all could hear. "Law's on my side." It sounded less like a statement than a challenge. Phones lifted. First one, then several, red dots glowing. Screens blinked awake, hands steadied. People who weren't filming crossed their arms or shifted uncomfortably, but their eyes stayed locked on the scene. The officer seemed to enjoy the attention, chest broad, voice rising. "You want to help him?" He jeered, pointing toward the boy. "Teach him respect." He looked into a nearby shop window, catching his own reflection as if it proved the story he was telling. A man holding a street together by force. The boy's mouth opened. "I didn't," he began, but the words fell apart. His chin tilted up, just enough to find the officer's nameplate, then dropped again. His hands hovered, unsure whether to protect himself or keep obeying. Someone in scrubs edged forward, instinctively reaching out. The officer snapped his fingers toward her. "Back up." She froze, hands still suspended, that small gesture suddenly charged with danger. "Sir," another voice called, steady, older. "That's enough." But the officer only smiled thinly. "Always the same," he muttered. "Didn't do anything." His tone carried amusement, like a well-rehearsed line. The crowd shifted closer, not quite committing. A teenager whispered, "Get his badge number." Then louder, "Film it." A woman angled her phone to catch the patch on his shoulder, fighting glare. The mob was forming without wanting to admit it. The boy managed to get both knees under him, chest heaving. He stared down at the pavement, pride and shame mixing in his eyes. The officer drew a long breath, lifted his hand as if preparing to punctuate his next command with a gesture big enough to own the street. The entire block tensed at once. The silence thickened, as though everyone knew something was about to snap. From the cafe, a chair scraped. Someone stood, the sound harsh against the hush. Heads turned, phones swung. A whisper cut through the air, quick, incredulous. "Wait, is that?" Through the press of bodies, a figure stepped forward. Plain shirt, slow stride, nothing dramatic, and yet the crowd parted without being asked. The officer's hand stalled mid-gesture. The boy turned, eyes widening as if he'd seen something impossible. The murmur spread faster than speech. "It's him." And for the first time, the officer's foot shifted back half an inch, as though the ground beneath him had tilted. "Where are you watching from?" Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. For a moment, the street was suspended in that strange paralysis where everyone knows something is wrong, but no one wants to own the risk of fixing it. The boy knelt, scraped and shaking, and the officer loomed over him like the center of gravity itself. The silence didn't last. It fractured into whispers and fragments of courage. "That's too much," someone hissed near the cafe. "He shoved him like a dog," came another voice. Somebody stop this. But it was quiet, embarrassed, as though the words themselves were dangerous. The officer fed off it. He spread his stance wider, hand brushing the hard weight of tools on his belt. Stay back, he barked again, louder than before, letting his voice carry. You think you're helping? Teach him to respect the law. His tone wasn't for the boy. It was for the audience, as if they were extras in a story he was writing in real time. Phones rose higher, one after another. At first it was cautious, an office worker pretending to check a message, a teenager holding his phone chest high. But hesitation melted fast. Screens glowed. Red record dots winked across the block like fireflies. Some zoomed close on the boy's bleeding arm, others on the badge, others wide to capture the confrontation entire. A woman muttered, "Film everything," and people obeyed. A live stream spun up, captions filling faster than the camera could keep still. Look what's happening on Larchmont. Strangers outside the block began typing judgments into the pocket of someone else's phone. The crowd, still standing right there, felt the reach of eyes they couldn't see. The boy's arms quivered as he tried to rise, one knee under him, the other foot sliding sideways on grit. He held his hands open, not defiant, not surrendering, just frozen, a posture of someone trying to calculate which gesture would do the least harm. His lips parted. I didn't. The words fell apart into dust. Always the song. The officer shot back, loud enough for the cameras to catch. He gave a short laugh, a dry thing. Didn't do anything. Same excuse every time. He wasn't speaking to the boy anymore. He was auditioning for the audience. The people responded without meaning to. Postures shifted, shoulders leaning forward or folding tight. A woman with a stroller rocked it harder though the child wasn't crying. A nurse in scrubs lifted a hand out of instinct, then froze when the officer snapped, "Don't." She let her hand hover in the space between mercy and risk. You think the badge makes you the law? Someone challenged from behind the cafe fence. It drew murmurs of approval and fear both. The law's watching, another muttered, angling her phone to catch his shoulder patch. The officer squared his body like he was on parade. This is America, he announced again, louder, feeding on his own echo. Law's on my side. That split the block clean down the middle. A few men near the barber shop nodded, arms crossed in support, as if to say he's right, let it go. Others sneered openly. A teenager scoffed, he's enjoying this. People didn't argue directly, but you could see the lines in the way they leaned. A bike courier slowed, putting one foot down on the pavement. Yo, he called, careful. He's on the ground already. Keep moving. The officer barked, and the courier almost did. Almost. Instead, he slid off his saddle and stayed. The theater grew. A man with his phone raised narrated. We're at Larchmont. Officers got a kid down. Back. The officer roared, stepping forward, the step itself louder than the word. The man retreated but kept recording. It became impossible not to take sides, even if silently. A mother whispered, "Leave it," like a prayer. A younger voice countered, "Not this time." Neither knew who they were speaking to. The boy swallowed hard, breath catching in his chest. He lifted his chin just enough to see the officer's vest, then dropped his eyes again. Pride and shame pulled at him in opposite directions, both heavier than the shove that had put him on the ground. On your feet, the officer commanded. The words weren't instruction, they were punishment. The kid's shoe slipped, sole dragging a squeak across asphalt. His arms trembled, halfway between standing and falling. Don't yank him, the nurse said, louder now, but her voice disappeared under the next wave of murmurs. It was then the mood shifted. At first it was only a rustle, people turning their heads in the same direction, frowning into the sunlight. A chair scraped across pavement. Someone rose on tiptoe. What is it? A woman asked, shielding her eyes. No way, her friend whispered. Phones pivoted, lenses searching beyond the confrontation at the center. The murmur thickened, faster now, words tumbling over one another. Wait. Hold on. Look there. The officer sensed it. His chin jerked up, trying to drag the spotlight back. Eyes on me, he snapped. The command landed flat. The tide of attention had shifted. Even the boy, kneeling in dust, turned his head. Squinting through the heat shimmer, he saw a shape crossing from the cafe's shadow into the sun. A plain shirt, slow stride, no performance. Just a man walking like he'd already made up his mind. The whispers sharpened into disbelief. Is that? One man muttered. Then, louder, with awe and certainty. That's him. The officer's hand, frozen mid-gesture, faltered. His sunglasses reflected something he couldn't twist to his own advantage. His boot scraped backward, half an inch. And the crowd, tense seconds earlier, inhaled as one body. The shift was palpable, like weather changing. "It's Chuck Norris," someone breathed, the name both relief and challenge. The street erupted in noise, phones raised higher, voices surging, energy trembling on the edge of chaos. He came forward without rush, without drama. Just a steady walk through the shimmer of heat, plain shirt catching a line of sun, steps landing like they belonged there. No fanfare, no words. The kind of entrance that works precisely because it doesn't try. The crowd shifted before realizing it was making space. Chairs scraped back, strangers edged sideways. A stroller rolled half a foot until the mother caught it with her shin. The courier on his bike straightened, foot touching down like something had changed the rules. Phones tilted higher. Every movement in the block bent toward the figure in the light. The officer stiffened, shoulders locking, chin lifting. Behind his mirrored lenses his eyes darted, calculating. He forced a grin, voice pitched louder. "What's next?" He called, half laugh, half challenge. "Bruce Lee from the clouds." The line was a joke by shape, but the wobble in it betrayed nerves. No reply. Chuck's gaze went first to the boy still kneeling, his scraped elbow, his trembling hands. He measured the damage like a craftsman looking at a broken tool. Only then did he lift his eyes to the officer. The boy whispered, "Don't." It wasn't a request for help, but a warning, small and ragged. Chuck heard it, acknowledged it with the briefest shift of his jaw, and kept walking. He stopped only when his shoes stood between the boy and the man in uniform. The silence deepened. Phones kept recording, but people weren't sure if they wanted to breathe too loud. Even the idling truck at the curb sounded softer, as if the engine had gone cautious. The officer tried again, chest swelling with borrowed confidence. "Sir, this is an active situation. Step back unless you want to be part of it." His hand hovered near his belt, but didn't land. His tone wasn't command. It was theater, aimed at the lenses pointed at him. Chuck didn't step back. He simply stood. His stillness itself became a refusal, and that refusal carried more weight than noise. He glanced at the nurse in scrubs, the woman clutching her phone, the courier frozen on his pedals. It wasn't for their approval. It was inventory, a quiet count of courage and fear. The boy tried again. "I didn't." His words fell apart. His lip trembled, his chin low. Chuck shifted a fraction, enough that if the boy collapsed he wouldn't hit concrete alone. The officer's grin faltered. He forced it back. "You think a name makes you the law?" he said, voice tight. He wanted laughter from the crowd, but none came. A voice broke through from the cafe fence. "Let the kid breathe." It rang sharp, a note of humanity slicing the stage. Scattered applause answered, brief but real, then quiet again. Chuck's eyes stayed on the officer, steady, unblinking. "He's on the ground," he said at last. For words, plain as water. The crowd heard them, phones caught them, and the air shifted. The officer seized on the gap. "That's because he didn't listen," he snapped. "And neither are you." He stepped forward. Chuck matched him, step for step, equal distance. The geometry changed, a line now, no triangle. Two men facing each other, with a boy sheltered by the space one had claimed. The boy tried to stand, legs shaky, scraped skin stinging. Chuck didn't grab him, only hovered a hand near enough to grant balance without stealing dignity. The crowd leaned with the movement. A nurse whispered, "Easy." The officer's tone sharpened. "Move." But he didn't finish with a consequence. He didn't have one. Chuck's chin tilted, enough to show he'd heard but wouldn't comply. "He's standing," he said quietly. And the boy did, half upright, half trembling, but upright. The crowd inhaled together, the sound of a verdict in progress. The officer's hand twitched, rising, uncertain if it meant to warn or strike. Chuck slid forward another inch, close enough to remeasure the distance. He still didn't touch the man, but the message was loud. The line had shifted, and it wasn't his to redraw. For the first time that afternoon, the officer's boots scraped backward, grit crunching under the sole. Phones caught it, screens shaking. The crowd felt the balance tilt. From the barbershop doorway, an old man spoke with weary calm. "Officer, let it breathe." His tone landed like truth too obvious to argue. And then, faint but growing, A siren began to thread its way down the street. The sound curled between buildings, high and thin at first, then swelling, pulling every gaze for half a second before snapping back to the standoff in the sun. Chuck didn't move. The officer's lip tightened. The boy's chest heaved. And the question hung heavy in the heat. What line comes next, and who dares to draw it? The officer felt the crowd tipping against him, so he did what men like him always did when balance slipped. He raised his voice. The badge gleamed in the sun as if it could amplify authority. His boots were set wide, chest inflated, words barked sharp enough to cut. "You're not a hero here, Norris," he shouted, chin jutting as though height alone might carry force. "This is my city. I decide what order is." The claim rattled through the block. Some spectators winced, others leaned in, every phone catching the declaration. A box truck idled at the curb, its engine low but still present, a bass note under the scene. A woman with a stroller drew it closer to her shin. A teenage boy whispered, "He's really saying this to Chuck Norris?" The whisper became echo, and soon the crowd knew the moment had tipped beyond ordinary. Chuck still hadn't spoken. Instead, he turned his head toward the boy who had been shoved down, bent at the waist, and reached a steady hand beneath his elbow. "Slow," he murmured, just audible, his eyes never leaving the officer. The boy wobbled as he tried to stand, breath hitching, scraped knee grinding against denim. Chuck's hand offered balance, not rescue. When the kid finally rose, half straight and trembling, the crowd applauded in uneven bursts. The sound unsettled the officer more than silence had. He forced out a laugh, too sharp, too brittle. His arm carved the air like a sword as he tried to claim the stage. "Look at this," he called, flashing his teeth for a nearby camera. "Now we're doing a show. You all came for order. You're getting a performance." But his grin wavered when the applause didn't die. People on the cafe patio clapped again, louder, voices mixing with the staccato bursts of shudders. The courier tapped his palm against his handlebar, producing a dull knock that cut through the heat like a gavel. Chuck shifted slightly, putting himself between the officer and the boy. No flourish, no aggression, just geometry. His stillness was heavier than any gesture. His open hands rested at his sides. He didn't flinch when the officer stepped closer. "Do you hear me?" The officer barked. "I said step aside." He swung his arm like punctuation. His eyes darted behind his lenses, searching for authority he thought the crowd had already granted. No reply. Chuck stood, quiet as stone. The air between them grew so taut that when a bottle toppled on a cafe table, it startled half the block. The clang rang far louder than glass should. "Say it again," a teenager called, voice cracking with the strange courage of fear. "Say it to his face." The line triggered others. "Enough. Let him go. We're filming." The chorus didn't blend, but its meaning was united. They weren't with the badge anymore. The officer's smirk collapsed for an instant before he pulled it back on. "What's the plan, Norris? You going to teach me a lesson out here on my street?" He wanted laughter. He got silence. Chuck finally turned his head just enough to acknowledge the crowd without surrendering the moment. Then his gaze returned to the officer. His face was calm, but the line of his jaw said there was no retreat coming. He didn't move when the officer closed the distance again. Instead, he angled his shoulders subtly, so the boy behind him was fully covered. It was then, at the peak of tension, that Chuck spoke for the first time that afternoon. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. True law isn't a performance. The phrase landed like a stone into still water. The ripples spread immediately, through the cameras, through the witnesses, through the summer heat itself. People felt it settle inside their chests. The officer seized on the pause. "That's right," he sneered, desperate to recover ground. "Words. All you've got is words." He threw his hands wide to display his badge, his gun, his frame. "I've got the badge, I've got the law, I've got the right." Phones zoomed closer. The crowd's hum deepened. Someone muttered, "Not anymore." Chuck angled closer to the boy, silent reassurance, then squared to face the officer fully. He let the hush hold for another long breath, then broke it again, his tone as even as before. "True law begins where humiliation ends." It wasn't delivered like a strike. It was quieter than the officer's threats, but the crowd erupted as if it had been thunder. Cheers ripped from the cafe, applause cracked from the barber's doorway, fists rose into the humid air. Some jeered the officer, others shouted Chuck's name, and phones lifted higher, desperate to catch the eruption. The officer's jaw locked. A muscle jumped near his ear. He tried to laugh, but it came out thin. He shoved forward another step, chest to chest with the man who refused to move. And for a long, tight instant, the city belonged to silence after a sentence. The officer's face reddened, heat swelling in his neck, jaw grinding hard enough to twitch. The cheers from the crowd stung him worse than any insult. His hand clenched and unclenched at his side, as if unsure whether it wanted to draw, push, or simply shake the air. He closed the distance one more step and shouted into the sun. "You think you've got control here?" His spit caught the light as he roared. "Step back, Norris, before you regret it." The boy flinched behind Chuck. The nurse in scrubs hissed, "Don't," but her voice drowned beneath the officer's bellow. Dozens of phones leaned forward like hungry eyes, each red dot glowing, every angle capturing the widening crack in his composure. The crowd roared too, but not with him. "Leave him alone. We see you. Don't touch him." Their voices layered into a wall of sound that pushed back harder than any arm. People weren't watching a cop keep order. They were watching a man unravel. The officer's fury peaked. His hand shot out and landed heavy on Chuck's shoulder, fingers digging as if to prove dominance. He shoved, a quick, jerking motion meant to move the man out of the way, to make the cameras catch obedience. But Chuck didn't move. Not an inch. His feet stayed rooted on the grit, spine straight, eyes calm. The shove looked less like control and more like a child pressing against stone. Gasps spread through the block. Some cursed. One phone shook so badly the feed blurred. The boy froze, afraid to breathe. Chuck moved then, slow, deliberate, not to strike, but to remove. His hand rose, found the officer's wrist, and peeled it away, finger by finger, until the grip broke. He lowered the man's arm gently, almost respectfully, and let it fall useless at his side. The contrast was brutal. The officer screamed his authority with veins bulging, but Chuck's quiet refusal stripped the sound of its teeth. The crowd recognized the imbalance instantly. Cheers erupted, swelling until they rolled off the buildings like thunder. "Do you see that?" someone shouted, voice cracking with awe. He didn't even fight back. Phones zoomed tighter, catching the officer's red face, the sweat shining along his temple, the tremor in his hand. His attempt at laughter cracked like glass under weight. "Don't test me, Norris," he screamed, spit flying again. "Don't think you can walk in here and—" But his sentence broke when he realized the silence around Chuck had more force than his rage. Chuck didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He stood the same as before, unshaken, untouched, as if the shove had never happened. Why doesn't he react? The courier muttered, "Are replacing fear." He's not even angry. The nurse gripped her chest again, whispering, "That's strength," to no one in particular. The officer took another step, chest to chest again, nose inches away, his breath ragged, smelling of coffee gone bitter in the heat. He roared, "Step aside, or I'll put you down myself." And still Chuck did nothing but breathe. His chest rose and fell steady, the rhythm unnerving in its simplicity. His stillness turned the officer's noise into something smaller, almost desperate. The crowd began chanting. Some shouted, "Chuck! Chuck!" Others screamed, "Let him be." The sound pressed in, a wave pounding the officer's balance. His authority, once unquestioned, now dangled by a thread that he kept yanking harder with every scream. Phones were everywhere, capturing not a battle but a collapse. In some lenses, the officer looked monstrous, in others pathetic, but in none did he look in control. Chuck slowly turned his head toward the crowd, just briefly, acknowledging their noise. His eyes seemed to say, "Stay steady." Then he faced forward again, unbroken. The officer lost patience. His scream hit a new pitch, desperate and shrill. He lunged, shoulder rolling as if ready for a strike, body coiled with fury. And then came the pause, the one everyone felt in their bones. The moment right before contact. The silence that arrives when people realize they are watching something irreversible spool into being. The cafe patio froze. The courier gripped his handlebars tight. Even the baby in the stroller stopped fussing. Chuck didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed. His silence was a wall, and it held. The officer took one last furious step, teeth bared, hand curling into a fist. The crowd's chant broke into fragments, screams, gasps, pleas. Phones tilted higher, and the block itself seemed to exhale as the officer prepared to cross the line. The officer lunged, arms surging forward, fist tightening in midair. The crowd shrieked as one, dozens of voices overlapping. Don't. Stop. Cameras. The sound was panic and demand, desperation woven into one sharp note. Phones trembled and raised hands, recording what everyone feared would become violence. But before the blow could fall, Chuck moved. No flourish, no cinematic spin, just a sudden, precise shift of weight. His hand rose and caught the officer's wrist mid-swing, stopping the motion clean. The impact of palm on forearm echoed sharper than a strike, not because of noise, but because of what it meant. One simple interception had undone all the fury built for minutes. The officer froze, arm locked in Chuck's grip. His shoulders strained forward, muscles trembling, but the fist went nowhere. Gasps cracked through the block, high-pitched and raw. A woman screamed, and the sound dissolved into stunned silence when she realized no second movement came. Chuck hadn't hit him. He had only stopped him. The image was unforgettable. One man red-faced, teeth clenched, body shaking with rage, and another calm, breathing evenly, hands steady as steel. Chuck didn't squeeze, didn't twist. He just held. And that holding proved more powerful than any strike could have been. "Do you see that?" Someone yelled from the cafe patio, voice cracking with awe. He stopped him without fighting. The officer's face burned crimson. His jaw quivered as he tried to yank free, but the motion only exposed the tremor in his body. Chuck's grip was firm, yet strangely gentle, like a father restraining a son mid-tantrum. The contrast shredded what authority the officer had left. Chuck leaned closer, his voice low but captured perfectly by the microphones of dozens of phones. "Strength isn't breaking. Strength is holding yourself back." It wasn't a threat. It was a lesson, and it dropped into the block with the weight of undeniable truth. The crowd erupted. Cheers boomed, fists punched the air, names shouted into the heat. Some clapped, some wept, some only stood with hands covering their mouths. The boy, half hidden behind Chuck, finally exhaled as though he hadn't breathed since he'd hit the ground. The officer's fury collapsed into something uglier, helplessness. His arm twitched again, but there was no escape from the grip. His other hand hovered, undecided between reaching for his belt or clawing at dignity. He didn't do either. His legs braced against the asphalt like he was fighting a current stronger than himself. And still Chuck held him. No more, no less. He didn't humiliate, didn't shove him down, didn't raise a fist. The power came from restraint, and the crowd understood it instantly. They roared louder. But then, new sound. A siren, closer now, flooding between buildings, blue and red lights flickering against glass panes up the block. The crowd shifted. Some cheered, thinking reinforcement meant justice. Others shouted warnings, afraid this was about to turn into something darker. The tension ratcheted higher, splitting the bystanders into factions. "Protect him," someone screamed. "Film everything," another yelled. Dozens of lenses shook in the hot air, documenting every second. The officer tried to speak, his words mangled by fury and shame. "You're done. Norris, you're finished." He couldn't finish the sentence. His chest heaved, sweat sliding down his temple. Chuck didn't reply. He kept his grip for another breath, then slowly, deliberately released. The officer's arm dropped uselessly to his side. Chuck's hand returned to stillness at his hip. He stepped back half a pace, putting the boy clearly behind him again. For a heartbeat, the entire block was suspended in silence. The officer stood trembling, Chuck unshaken, the boy clutching his scraped elbow, the crowd vibrating with adrenaline. And then the lights splashed closer. Patrol cars nosed into view, sirens cutting short, the sudden hush of engines replacing them. Officers stepped out, hands near belts, faces unreadable. The crowd split into a storm. Cheers, shouts, cries for protection, accusations hurled at the badge. Chaos spiraled in sound alone. Chuck didn't move. He stood like he had from the beginning, rooted, steady, eyes fixed. The first arriving officer froze at the sight. His colleague, red-faced and shaken, and Chuck Norris standing calm in front of a boy, surrounded by a mob of witnesses. The new officer hesitated, caught between training and instinct, between solidarity and truth. And in that hesitation, the story balanced on a knife edge. The crowd screamed. The boy clung to Chuck's sleeve. The restrained officer glared with a hatred he couldn't voice. Phones caught every angle. Millions would see it before the hour was done. The block itself held its breath. And the question, left hanging sharper than any blow, was simple. Would this moment mark justice, or the spark of chaos that no one could put back?